to Social Studies 20-1 for the Introduction to Internationalism. If I haven't met you yet, hi, I'm Miss Fallowfield, and I am here to walk you through our little presentation today. So we are talking about internationalism. You guys have just finished learning all about World War I and II and the way that the interactions between nations shaped conflict and resolution and moving forward. You've heard a little bit about some examples of internationalism and the way that that relates to national interest and how that shapes foreign policy. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the ideology of internationalism and a variety of types. You will see that attached to this document there is an assignment and there is also a notes package. Please open up the notes package, print it off, do what you need to do to follow along in a way that suits your learning style best. If you want, I will just go through all of this and then you can go through, check the slides on their own, and then fill in the blanks yourself. If you're someone who takes your own notes, that's great, that's awesome. Do what you need to do to feel successful here. I will be posting this presentation, the notes package to go along with this, as well as the slides themselves, so you can take some time after I'm done presenting, after you're done watching this, and do whatever you need to do. So, internationalism is the belief that nations are needed to work together. So, breaking it down, we know that anything ending in ISM is an ideology, a system of beliefs. International would be between, inter means between. So if you break down any ideology phonetically, you're good to go. So we believe that nations need to work together if we are prescribing to the philosophy of internationalism. There are three different understandings, or I guess you could call them types of internationalism that we're going to cover today. The first being liberal internationalism, the second hegemonic internationalism, and the third revolutionary internationalism. So liberal internationalism is the type of internationalism that the majority of you think of when you think internationalism. Side note, if anyone wants to keep a track of how many times I say internationalism in this presentation, it's probably like 150. This is the rainbows and sunshine and everything's great and everyone's unified and together and we love each other and working together is so much better than working alone. And it implies this idea of peace and prosperity as inherent. So when we think about liberal internationalism, we think about people who acknowledge that what happens in one place in the world is happening to all of us. We are a shared humanity. We are not taking things in nation by nation by nation, affecting only one set of the population. Everything affects everyone. So we can see this in political means, but also in economic means. We know that liberal or free trade is something that will likely reduce conflicts between states. We know that if you have a good trade relationship with someone and you are getting a mutually beneficial result from engaging with another country through trade, you are so much less likely to go into conflict with them. With liberal internationalism comes the assumption that interaction and cooperation are on equal terms and are mutually beneficial. In science, we talk about symbiotic relationships where you're gaining as much as you're giving, you're taking as much in as you are giving out. And that is what liberal internationalism stands for. We're making sure that people are engaging in a positive relationship where each are benefiting, ideally, equally between the interaction, whether that's economic, whether that's political. That's what we're hoping for. So there are a few examples of liberal internationalism that exist in our world or formally exist in our world. We know that the League of Nations, though it unfortunately failed, was a first step towards liberal internationalism. And hopefully we all remember that Woodrow Wilson really felt that this was the key to global peace and prosperity long term. And while the League of Nations ultimately failed, the words are really hard and it's weird not talking to anyone, sorry. The United Nations, which is the organization that came after the League of Nations, was very positive. Overall, we'll talk about this a little bit more, and you'll see a little bit more in the assignment that's coming up for you. The United Nations exists to promote that mutual understanding, the benefits to all members, the communication, collaboration, cooperation that liberal internationalism is founded on. We also see that NGOs, so non-governmental organizations that highlight humanitarian efforts, are great examples of liberal internationalism. Slightly conflicted, depending who you ask, depending on what perspective you take, the World Trade Organization exists as an example of liberal internationalism. We know that there have been some criticisms, but ultimately this organization was created to allow nations the opportunity to thrive through cooperation. So that is liberal internationalism as organizations. So a brief piece on the United Nations. This is not an exhaustive list, but realistically, this is based on internationalism, and it's a collective security organization created at the end of the Second World War. We know the League of Nations preceded this, didn't work so well after the First World War, ergo we had a Second World War, but its main goals or jobs are to maintain international peace and security, create and promote better standards of living and human rights across the globe, and to develop friendly relationships between nations and to promote social progress. So that's not just economic progress, but also social progress. When we talk a little bit more about the United Nations and their organs and the bodies that they exist and the successes that we have, it's important to check how well they're doing at fostering and promoting these three central jobs or goals of the United Nations. So, while everyone would like to believe that the world is sunshine and rainbows and everyone wants to cooperate and collaborate and share and everyone's going to derive equal benefit, many people criticize or reject the idea of liberal internationalism because how can every agreement be mutually and equally beneficial? We know that globally there's a great divide between have nations and have nots, the global north and the global south. The terms first world and third world are not politically accurate anymore, so refrain from using those. If you want to talk about nations, you could talk about industrialized or industrializing. So nations like Canada, the United States, most of Europe is going to fall under industrialized. And industrializing are your countries that are working to getting there. So countries like India, countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, things like that. Are going to be industrializing. You can also talk about the global north or the global south, but to use the terms first and third world are not accurate anymore. So remove those from your vocabulary. So we know that there's no level playing field. Some countries have a lot of resources and a lot to invest, and others don't have as much. We know that if everything's mutually beneficial, you're giving as much as you're getting, which isn't going to be the case if you're an industrializing nation working with an industrialized nation. You just have different resources and different qualities to bring to the table. And generally speaking, when we talk about humanitarian efforts, so things that are aiming to provide relief or infrastructure, we can see the donor countries' values imposed through the way that they're trying to assist. So this can be cultural, social, economic, or political in nature, but really you're seeing the values of that likely Western or industrialized nation being imposed onto someone else. So these are some of the reasons why liberal internationalism isn't the be-all, end-all, wonderful sunshine and rainbows that it might be interpreted as. So this is just that secondary perspective. Our second internationalism type we're going to talk about is hegemonic internationalism. Now, you might have heard this word in Social 10, and it's realistically the best way I can describe it is kind of like an international bully. It's someone that pushes or defines what other nations can or can't do. And while nations can be sovereign and self-determining, the hegemonic form of internationalism pushes one nation's ideas, values, or agreements in a way that would benefit that more powerful nation. Hegemony really comes from power and what you're able to do. And that can be through economic means. It could be through military force. And these are generally done by very strong nations who have both the political and economic capacity to impose their will on smaller or less powerful nations. So people who support hegemonic internationalism really believe that when the certain nations, so these strong and very powerful nations, assert themselves, it is more readily accessible that we're going to have international security and prosperity. If you put a strong voice in charge and you let people follow that strong voice, why wouldn't it be great? Another supporter would say that one dominant language makes business and political conversations easier. And we know from Social 10 and our legacies of historical globalization that the British were one of the world's most successful supervillains, and they almost took over the whole world. And that's why the dominant language of commerce is English. It continues to be perpetuated by an enormously hegemonic superpower in the United States, where the dominant language is also English. We look at the way that hegemonic nations have shaped the world, starting with the Roman Empire taking over most of Europe, and the British Empire, as I said earlier, taking over pretty much the whole world. They have dominated politically, economically, and the systems that they've put in place are still in use, which credits the fact that hegemonic nations derive their power from being successful. And if something works, why would we change it? Why would we challenge what is happening and what is happening well? Now, examples of hegemonic nations, I touched on this a little bit in the previous slide, is the United States. So they have led several movements against other ideologies that they deem detrimental. And we talk about communism, and when you get to Social 30 next year, you're going to talk about the Cold War. And this is a conflict of ideology between capitalism and communism, the United States, the USSR, or the Soviet Union, and how these two ideologies are going head to head to assert themselves as a global superpower. We also see in more recent times the United States declaring the war on terror in the early 2000s. They are also leading the liberalization of trade movement, and something again that we're drawing from Social 10, liberalization is making it free, making it easier. We're liberating trade, we're promoting it on this global scale that everyone should be able to interact, and there shouldn't be taxes and tariffs placed on those to promote global trade and enterprise. However, just as with liberal internationalism, there are some rejections and people who criticize hegemonic internationalism. So when you are a powerful country shaping interactions, you are likely more able to shape them to your own benefit. You are going to derive more from that interaction because you bring a little bit more to the table. They're all about maintaining their power, and this often comes at the expense of others, which is a problem if you're really trying to work together. If you are just imposing and imposing and imposing to derive more and more and more and more, you're only benefiting yourself and underwriting the true nature of internationalism, which is collaboration and cooperation. We see that this does not respect diversity of view or self-determination. As we learned in Social 10, with the ability of the British and other colonial and imperial powers, they eroded a lot of culture, and they took a lot away from people who were already finding ways to meet their own needs successfully. It forces one singular view onto the world, and just because it's effective does not mean it's the only way of doing things. And this removes the idea of diversity and the idea of self-determination, which you touched on in the other unit, and the ability for states to make choices for them, for their benefit, specifically in the areas of social and cultural norms. Our final type of internationalism that we're going to touch on today is revolutionary internationalism. And if you were to think about these types of internationalism, you have liberal internationalism as what we would all love and cherish if everyone could be equal and joyful, and you just want to bake a cake and put your emotions in it, and it's great. But you've got hegemonic internationalism, which says let the powerful be powerful, let them be in charge. And opposite to that, you're going to have revolutionary internationalism. And people who support revolutionary internationalism want to challenge that dominant view of how the world should be. We shouldn't just accept power structures because they have worked and that's the only way to do things. We need to push the boundaries. And revolutionary internationalism says that conflicts in society are determined by these international factors, these power structures that are being imposed onto others. So people who support it say that countries should have that right to self-determination and they should be able to protect their own diversity. We don't need the domination of these outside forces, these other nations. We are opposed to colonialism, imperialism, spheres of influence. And just to touch on spheres of influence, it's the way that you are able to affect those around you. If you think about your sphere of influence, I'll use myself as an example. My personal sphere is probably my best friends. If I'm going to talk to them and I recommend a product, I have a reputation of being very good at knowing what my friends like. So if I tell them that they should try something, they should go somewhere, they should get something, they're going to do it. So my sphere of influence is small because it's just the people that I know. When you think about countries, it's the people that you interact with, the recommendations that they're making, the trade agreements, the way that you're shaping your interactions together. And they're opposing that and saying, I don't want someone else to make my choices for me. I don't want someone else to be pushing this information, these recommendations, these ideas. I want to get there on my own. I want to find what I like. I want to find what works for myself, for my community, and move forward. So some examples of revolutionary internationalism, we've touched on a few of these in this course. So the American Revolution is American citizens resisting British hegemony, British imperialism, and advocating for their self-determination. The French Revolution, which you should all remember so vividly from the beginning of this course, were rejecting the absolute monarchy, the divine right of kings, the idea of absolutism, and the feudal system as a whole. So this was acting against a system that was not working for the third estate, as we should all be familiar. We also see environmentalism and feminism coming up as examples of revolutionary internationalism. We should not have the idea of exploiting the planet for wealth for those who believe in environmentalism, and the idea that women should be treated as anything less than equals is advocating for the right of women, which is traditionally against the general norm. Now, revolutionary internationalism also has its critiques, and while internationalism exists to promote cooperation between nations, this idea of struggle against the traditional power structures and pushing against what already exists in its entirety leads to conflict, which could create global instability. People are not generally in the business of enjoying being at war or being in times of conflict. So when we see this instability, another byproduct of this could be that trade liberalization and economic relationships suffer as well. These in turn can lead to violence and will disturb a nation's ability to gain wealth. So while you're trying to assert yourself as an individual, as a player who's meeting your own needs, on the global scale, the idea still needs to be centered on the fact that nations need to be able to provide for themselves and gain wealth. And if you're in a constant state of turmoil and upheaval and pushing and powers struggling against powers, it's going to inhibit your ability to continually gain your wealth and things that will help with the peace and prosperity and your economic gains in a nation. So, when we spent our entire last unit talking about national interest and how nations were able to meet their own needs, whether that's for safety and security, future or current economic prosperity, or the social cultural beliefs of their citizens, we learned that often your national interest could not be met by you alone. Ultimately, countries want to make their national interests happen, and oftentimes this will lead to internationalism being pursued to achieve these goals. So the question and the essential question that nations continually ask themselves is, how much foreign policy is the right amount for us? How much internationalism do we need to engage with to meet our national interest? Most nations are looking out for themselves first, and occasionally they will pursue internationalism to reach that. The extent is, do we pursue a small amount of internationalism? Do we pursue more internationalism than nationalism and hope that it trickles down and meets our needs? These are the questions that governments and officials and representatives and citizens are asking themselves. How can I meet my needs? How much other people do I need? How much interaction with others? And what does that interaction look like? Are we pursuing a full liberal international policy? Are we a superpower pursuing hegemonic internationalism to ensure that we stay on that track to maintain power and promote ourselves? Are we pursuing revolutionary internationalism where we say, no, this is not an acceptable amount of oppression or of lack of diversity and we're not here for it? How can we adjust and reflect that? So the essential question that we're going to talk about all throughout Unit 3 is, to what extent should foreign policy promote internationalism? Is it to a full extent as long as it's liberal, to a minimal extent if it's revolutionary, to a moderate extent if it's hegemonic? That sort of thing. So the conversations we're going to have, and the question you need to ask yourself as we go through case studies and as we forge forward through this unit is, what amount of internationalism is here? What kind of internationalism is here? And why is it working? Why isn't it working? Some key terms we're going to explore through this as well are unilateralism, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about how you break down words. Ism, we know it's an ideology right away, a system of thought, a way of being. When you talk about uni, with the exception of university, think about a unicycle. How many wheels does it have? 1. So unilateralism is when a country responds to an event by themselves, completely alone. We're going to do what we feel like doing. We're the only people who have a choice in that. Let's go. The second one, think about a bicycle. Bilateralism, that's 2 countries. So, for example, if France and Germany came together and responded to the same issue collaboratively, that would be bilateralism. Multilateralism involves several countries working together. So this is 3 or more, and they have a more powerful voice than they would alone. The specific example we want to think about is middle powers. So not those superpowers like the United States. Canada, absolutely a middle power. If Canada and maybe Germany and other countries worked together, they would have a little bit more pull together than they would alone. Now, supranationalism is bigger than multilateralism. It involves the decisions of an international organization, and the most supranational organization is the European Union. We talk a little bit more about this as we move through this unit, but the European Union is made up of states in Europe, go figure, that not only have their own governments, but government above that. So the United Nations isn't a government, it's a bunch of representatives coming together to talk, but the European Union actually has a government organization within it. And finally, the last term is isolationism. So this is a country who completely avoids interacting with the rest of the world. They are going to do their own thing. They are not going to react. So unilateralism and isolationism are different. Unilateralism is a country responding to something as one unit, and isolationism is shutting down, closing the doors, not interacting with other nations. We're going to take it all the way back to Social 8 when you learned about Japan. And before 1854, Japan had a policy of isolationism. The United States and Commodore Matthew Perry came at this point and started engaging with Japan. But before this, they focused only on Japan, only on Japanese industry, values, productions, and people. So this can be super beneficial. This can also relate to, I lost my whole train of thought. This is really hard when there's no kids in front of you giving you anything. Like, this is hard. My kitchen cabinets are not the most engaging audience. I'm sorry. Lost it. What you need to know is isolationism means I'm alone. I am literally an island. In the case of Japan, that works double because it's an island. It's easy to say no one else, just us. So that is the end of my little lecture. To give you a summary of what's going on, what happened, why this matters. All you need to know, there are 3 types of internationalism: liberal, sunshine, rainbows, happiness, joy. Then you have hegemonic internationalism, which is powerful countries continuing to be powerful, exerting that power on others. And the third is revolutionary internationalism, which says we want to challenge the traditional way that it's been done. We want to assert diversity. We want to do all of these varieties of things that will allow us to be prosperous as we choose, even if that's not the main way that we've done it. So there's examples of that. We're going to talk specifically about different types of organizations and what an organization that promotes liberal internationalism or hegemonic internationalism or revolutionary internationalism looks like. We're going to talk about nations who have actually pursued these types of internationalism and what this looks like. So you have a little assignment posted down below. You have your notes posted down below. and I will give you all of the slides that I just presented. I hope you have an excellent week. Your teachers have different schedules of when they're doing their office hours. So if you didn't love the sound of my voice, that's okay. You can check in with another teacher. We will have all of those posted, and I look forward to connecting with all of you again. Enjoy your week, stay healthy and safe, and enjoy your long weekend. Bye.